G'day, welcome to another episode of Built by Dan and yet another installment in my GT40 kit build series. In today's episode, I'm going to be focusing on preparing my Gen 3 Coyote crate engine and my Graziano 6-speed transaxle ready for a test fit into the chassis. So in order to prep my crate engine, a couple of things that need to be done. Firstly, I need to remove this Mustang exhaust header. It's not going to suit the GT40 application. I also need to remove the flywheel. This flywheel, again, it's for the Mustang setup. It's not going to work with the Graziano transaxle. It's far too large. In fact, I wouldn't even be able to fit the adapter plate on with that as is. And then on this side, I'm concerned that this oil filter and oil filter or oil cooler is going to hang down too low, potentially hitting one of the chassis rails that I assume is going to run through at about this point. So I will try and measure up the chassis before I remove it, but I'm pretty confident that is going to have to be removed. Now, moving forward, I have already ordered a Mishimoto replacement. So instead of having the oil cooler mounted here, using coolant for the engine to also cool the oil, I'm going to go with an air-cooled oil cooler. So I've got a sandwich plate that will mount in here. The filter will mount to the sandwich plate, and then I'll run a couple of braided lines out to a separate oil cooler. And I'm hoping that that oil cooler will be able to mount just in front of the left-hand side rear tyre, and we'll be able to be fed air from one of the side scoops on the rear clamshell body panel. Other than that, I have just taped up all little hose connections just so they don't get any dust or dirt in them. The oil pan, I have done a quick measurement. Now, if you've seen last episode, if you haven't, I'll link it here. But this oil pan is far too large. It hangs down far too low. It'll probably be the lowest point on the car. It won't scrape on the ground, but it does sit forward of those rear wheels. So it's likely that if I go over a speed bump, I will connect with it. It is only composite. I have ordered a replacement low profile oil pan, so once that gets here I'll be able to fit that up. But for now I'm confident that I can probably at least test fit it because the car's sitting up so high on those chassis stands. So that's it for the engine. I'm going to get stuck straight into removing some of these components and then I'll jump onto the transaxle. Because before I do that, I do want to just test fit the adapter plate onto the engine before I go too far. Okay, so the first step is to remove the flywheel. There's just 8 bolts in here. They are a T55 socket type. So I'm just going to use my impact wrench and undo those. I just wanted to take it easy. I wasn't sure how rigidly mounted that might be, or whether it's sort of a press fit sort of thing. And I just didn't want it falling off. Given I have no use for this going forwards, I probably will look to potentially sell that. And I will need a custom flywheel made up to suit the Graziano application to these modular engines. There we go, it's rocking that side to side slightly, popped off nicely. Okay, I'm gonna leave the bolts in there. I'll tighten them up a little bit more later on, just so I don't lose them and I know where they belong. The next step will be to remove the exhaust manifold. So it looks like there are just 8 nuts holding that on. And they are just nuts because we have the studs that are mounted into the block. I've just put my impact wrench onto its lowest torque setting just to remove these the rest of the way. Okay, that's one exhaust manifold removed and the gasket here. Carefully remove that. Hopefully I may be able to reuse that, but I'm obviously going to need a custom exhaust header to be manufactured to suit my GT40. Okay, so the last item to be removed is the oil filter and oil cooler. I've just put a little tray underneath it. I don't expect there to be too many fluids in the engine, but there may just be some residual oil in here. Bit more than I was expecting. I might give that a minute just to drain out a bit. My tray didn't work too well after all. Okay, so we let most of the oil drip out of the filter and cooler. Now with a 14mm hex bit, I'm just going to loosen off this bolt here to remove the oil cooler itself. And there we go. So that's the bolt that passes through and just holds that cooler on. And that's it for that. I'm just going to cover up that hole as best I can to stop any further oil dripping as I'm trying to test fit the engine. So I'll clean this up and then I will actually, maybe even while that's just draining a little bit, I can flip the engine around. I can start looking at fitting off the adapter plate. Now, in order to do that, I am going to have to remove the engine from its cradle. So I'll have to get the engine hoist set up, take the weight off the engine so that I can remove this. You can see there's some locating pins here that also fit into the adapter plate, but there's a couple of bolts that need to be removed as I'll be using those bolt holes for the adapter. I'll go and get that sorted, clean up that oil, and we can then make a start on test fitting the adapter plate. Okay, so I've cleaned up the mess I made removing the oil filter and oil cooler. I also, in the process, thought I would check and try and drain the oil pan. Again, not expecting that there's going to be any oil in there. To my surprise, it was full of oil. As I said earlier, my understanding was that they had to be drained of all fluids to be shipped into Australia. Apparently not, or they managed to get away with it, either way. So that's now all been drained, which is good because I will have to replace that oil pan once I receive my low profile oil pan, which is on order. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to crane up this engine, unbolt the cradle that it's sitting on, the support frame, so that I can test fit the adapter plate to the rear of the engine here. So I'll spin the engine around to do that. And once that's been test fitted, I think I'll remove the adapter plate, press in all the bushings for both the adapter plate and the engine and transaxle mounts. I've got a couple of tubes that I need to remove from the engine bay, and then it should be ready for a test fit. I haven't decided how I'll tackle that yet. I might just try the engine on its own and then the transaxle on its own as separate components and make sure that that all works. And if that all goes together nicely, I'll then look to assemble them together and drop it all in as one unit. So let's get into it. So I'm just going to rest the engine there on the board, still being supported by the crane. And now I can grab my adapter plate and test fit that with the supplied bolts. Interestingly, it slides on perfectly when it's backwards. Might just need a rubber mallet or something to encourage that on. I am just going to measure the 2 pins here, the locating pins, and just make sure that they are, or that the hole in the adapter plate is the correct size before I start using any force to apply that. Okay, so I forgot to reset the camera. I did manage to get the adapter plate on. I don't know that it's going to come off with any real ease if I do need to remove it for any reason. But basically I just had to put a couple of the longer screws into these holes and just screw in each side a little bit more to press the adapter onto those locating pins. So I'm now just going through my bolts. I've got a diagram here from the manufacturer that just labels the bolts that have to go into each hole. I've already identified a bit of an issue there. Firstly, none of the spring washers fit the bolts. A couple of the bolts that need to be recessed down so that the transmission can sit over the top of it. The washers and the spring washers, so the flat washer and the spring washer, don't fit into the recess. And I'm supposed to have 2 cap head 40mm M10 screws, and I have 1 cap screw and 1 hex head, which isn't going to work because these bolts are the ones that need to go in that recess. And if I take the flat washer off, I've just pushed that in and there's only about 2 to 3 millimeters of thread that will actually engage for that bolt. My gut feel is that these actually need to be longer. They've specified the 40mm screws for these ones. I'm just going to double check I've got that right. Yep, they're definitely the 40mm ones. They're just not long enough to really engage the thread in those locating pins. So I think we're going to have to get some longer screws for those, but I'm going to push on and just try and fit off the rest of them. See how we go. Okay, so I've got a couple of 55mm cap head screws. I'm just having a look at where they go. They're labeled B3 and B4. So B3, one of them's here. And then my other 2 55mm with a flat washer. Again, these are all supposed to have a flat washer and a spring washer, but none of the spring washers fit on the thread or the shank. So this particular bolt needed a serrated washer, which is why I swapped that one out. And then I've got 2 more that look like they're probably a 45mm M10 with a serrated washer, and they go in B1 and B2 down here. Okay, so all I'm really missing now are just these 2 here that were the 40mm ones that are just too short. The other issue obviously being the hex head doesn't actually fit into that recess, so that bolt doesn't engage at all, and pretty useless when it needs to be recessed for the transaxle to sit flush over the top of it. I do have the fittings for the transaxle, which I might just see if I can grab a couple of the ones from the bottom. So I can grab a 45mm one. It's definitely a lot better in terms of the engagement. There's probably about 1/2 inch, 12mm. Again, no washer on that at the moment because I need to get some smaller ones. I'm just going to grab another 45 from the transaxle bolt kit. So that's it for the adapter plate fitting to the engine. All these other bolt holes here are in fact to mount the transaxle. I have noticed that there's probably supposed to be a couple of locating pins. I'm just looking at the transaxle over there. It does have a recess on the transaxle side as well. And obviously you've got the rebate here. Assuming that some sort of locating pin would go in there. No locating pins have been supplied with the kit, so I'll have to have a chat to the manufacturer about that, if it's something that I need to go and buy, or whether they're supposed to have supplied it and just didn't. So that's it for that. I think I'm going to go ahead and press in all of the bushes now into this adapter plate, the transaxle mounts and the engine mounts, and then I should be right to start looking to lift this in and test fitting into the engine bay. Okay, so I've now pressed the polyurethane bushings into the engine mounts, the transaxle adapter plate, and the transaxle mounts. And I've bolted the mounts onto the transaxle, the engine. I didn't show that whole process. You've seen me pressing bushings before. It's a fairly simple process. These are supplied with some installation grease. Make sure you use it, makes life a lot easier. And you just slowly press them in with a vise or a press if you've got one. Now I'm going to move across and prepare the chassis. I need to remove these two rear supports. So I'll unbolt them, and I'm also going to unbolt this rear support piece that holds the rear clip, or the rear clip's hinged off, so that I can hopefully fit the transaxle, or at least have it sit in place once I get that engine mounted in there. So I'm going to move things around a little bit, and I'll come back, remove those components from the chassis, and then we'll try and test fit that engine. Alright, so here I am all set up, ready to try and place the engine into the chassis. Obviously got the engine lifted up there on the crane. I've tried to get it up high enough to clear those shock towers. And rather than try and move the engine crane itself with the engine suspended, given that the chassis is on stands, on casters, and is a hell of a lot lighter than that engine and engine crane, I'm just going to actually slide the chassis underneath the engine. I have just double checked the width from one leg to the other for the crane is just over 1 meter, and the spacing between the legs on my chassis stands is about 1.3 meters. So I've got about 250 mil to play with. That should give me enough to make sure that I clear them and to be able to position the engine where it needs to go. Should be dead center, but it's not exactly hanging center on the crane just because of the lifting points. Wish me luck, here we go. All right, so this is how we're traveling so far. It's pretty tight, it's a big engine. A little bit of play at the front here, keeping in mind that that intake manifold needs to be flipped around so the intake will actually go to the rear. I think once we get down just below that roll bar, we'll be able to push the chassis back and the engine should fit in okay. Got a bit of clearance here to the shock towers, starting to fall back behind the shock absorbers itself, just making sure that I keep that or maintain that clearance with the adapter plate there. And on the other side, much the same. Not looking too bad, but in hindsight, I probably should have removed the roof spider. Would have just given me a little bit more clearance to the roll bar. So engine mounts are now clear of the shock towers. I just need to, as I said before, keep pushing it back to make sure that this adapter plate comes in behind this mount point here. Keep chipping away, slowly, slowly. Just having to maneuver the chassis a little bit so that I can clear the exhaust manifold studs. All right, I'm not saying too much, I'm concentrating. I just wanted to try and get the intake down a little bit lower. By tilting that engine back, I'm hoping I can tuck it under this sort of top tube of the rear firewall. Just need to make sure that I can maintain my clearance from the shocks at the rear here. Just straightening up the chassis a little bit. Actually, before I go too much further, I should remove these bolts from the adapter plate. I've got good clearance from the shocks now. I'm pretty confident that that intake will drop, or the throttle body I should say, rather than the intake. Probably would be a lot easier with another set of hands just helping to maneuver engine and chassis. Just a little bit more of an adjustment to try and get that throttle body underneath, because that's now limiting how far I can push the engine back. I've just about maxed out my adjustment there, but it is sitting lower, so I can now pull the chassis back so that I clear these suspension uprights. Still got plenty of clearance underneath to the oil pan. I'll see if I can drop this just a little bit more before I start to balance out on the engine leveler. This is going to be fun. There is not a lot of room at all to try and get that, try and swing the engine around to level it out to get the oil pan to fit in the cutout in there, or the space at the bottom of the chassis. Keep persisting. I think I'm just about to call it that this is not going to fit with the intake manifold on there, and the throttle body just seems to be really getting stuck on the chassis. I'm just not going to be able to get the rotation that I need. Okay, so this is where I got to. Either need to do something about the intake manifold and the throttle body there that's sitting pretty well hard up against the rear firewall, or the alternative would be save a couple of inches underneath with the low profile oil pan. Either way, it's going to be a pretty tight fit to get it in there. It's a shame, it's almost there. But with the limitation down here in terms of clearance to the oil pan, and then the top of the engine here, the valve covers, throttle body, I just can't rotate the engine around anymore to try and just tuck it in there. So it looks like I might need to wait for my low profile oil pan to turn up, which is a shame. I'm gonna have to pull all this out now. Same process, probably take me twice as long, trying to be careful. The other thing, I really wanted to get this in because I've got concerns about this oil filter. Now I went and found an oil cooler system. It's from Mishimoto. It's just a sandwich plate that runs out to a remote oil cooler. So I've purchased that, but looking at it now, I actually think there's still not going to be enough room there for the oil filter itself. So I think I'm going to need an oil filter relocation kit as well. So I'll have to do the oil filter relocation kit and a remote oil cooler setup to be able to run this engine in this chassis. I suppose the things you work out when you try and test fit the engine, that's the whole point of trying to do this test fit, to see if everything will actually fit. It's almost there. It's a real shame. I'm pretty disappointed. I was really hoping to get the engine in and at least even be able to sit the transaxle behind it. Is what it is. I'll probably wrap it up there. I'm going to have to pull this engine out. I might just play around with it a little bit more off camera and see if I can get it to squeeze in. I don't like my chances. If I do, I'll come back. If not, we'll call it the end of this episode there, and I'll come back next episode when I have the low profile oil pan, and I may even need to look at getting some support in replacing that intake manifold so that I can flip it around 180 and give me a bit more clearance there as well. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I was hoping to make a little more progress. You know, it's a pretty big milestone to be able to get the engine test fitted and transaxle, obviously. We'll get there soon. Thanks for your support. All right, I'm back. It can only mean one thing. It has been a couple of days since I wrapped up recording in my previous attempt to fit the engine into the chassis. But I finally got there. So basically I've had to remove the oil pan, I had to remove the throttle body and this small hose that connected the intake manifold to the valve cover. I also had to remove the adapter plate. I couldn't get the engine on enough of an angle to lift that up over those little extensions off the chassis where it bolts in. So I unbolted it. I had to pry it off because it's got those couple of locating pins that are pressure fitted. There is not a lot of room to spare. It's really hard to get the camera in, but in the back here, there's barely 5 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch between the front of the engine and the firewall. And you can see straight away there, one of the coolant fittings there is actually protruding through the firewall. I'll have to look at whether I can actually either flip this around the other way so it angles a different direction, or find a different fitting that will do the same job. Last resort, I might just have to build a little bulge into that rear panel that gives enough clearance for that hose to come out. At the moment, it is already obviously protruding, but this is only the connection. By the time I still have, even if it was a 45-degree hose coming off that, it's going to stick out further into the cab. So now that that's in, I was excited to try and fit off the transaxle. However, I've already found a problem. Just here, one of my bottom bolts for the transaxle, there's definitely not enough clearance there from the chassis. I'm actually going to have to trim this a little bit more. You can see there's a bit of a notch in it there that pops out a bit wider. If that had just come down on the correct angle and sort of had a nice curve to it, it probably would have given me just enough clearance. So as it stands, this isn't going to work. I'm going to try and create a bit of a template, I think. This is the section where it would be fouling against the chassis. So it's not missing by much, but again, 1/4 of an inch. Everywhere else should be okay. So yeah, it's really just making sure that I've got enough clearance for this bolt and then just this section here, because it is still a fairly thick section. It's not like I can sit in behind that bit of the chassis against the, like there, it's not going to fit in between. So it definitely has to be clearanced along here, which is really annoying because now to get the space to clearance that, I pretty much have to remove the engine, or at least suspend the engine and unbolt and pry off that adapter plate to give me the clearance to get anything in there to do a nice neat job of clearancing the chassis. So I'm going to wrap the episode up there. The engine's in. I would have loved to have got the transaxle in as well. I'm going to go away and do a little bit of thinking as to how I might be able to tackle that without making too much of a mess, even if it's enough to just to get enough clearance to be able to test fit the transaxle, and then I can clean it up and make it smooth and look nice like it was meant to be that way once I pull the transaxle and engine out in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts on how the kit's coming along now that the engine's fitted.